The taste of blood and ozone still fills my mouth from when I first witnessed the web of fate unravel before my eyes. My name is Farseer Alaithriel of Craftworld Ulthwé, last surviving member of the Circle of Seven, who delved too deep into the Prophecies' true nature. 847,000 possible futures collapsed into a single inevitable thread that night, and the screaming hasn't stopped since. You think that makes me mad, cursed by forbidden knowledge, but you don't know what I've seen in the shifting paths of destiny. The Eldar prophecies aren't divine guidance or ancient wisdom as our kind believes. They're a trap, a web spun across 10 million years by something that feeds on our attempts to change fate. Every vision we follow, every timeline we manipulate, every war we prevent or start feeds the thing that devours possibility itself. This is my testimony before madness claims what remains of my fractured mind. Chapter 1. The circle forms the dome of crystal seers rose like a captured star above Ulthwe's wraithbone paths, its psychic resonance humming through my bones as I approached for what would be our final gathering. 7 of us had been called, 7 Farseers whose combined sight could pierce deeper into the web of fate than any had dared for 3 millennia. The number itself should have warned us. 7 paths, 7 fates, 7 ways to damn ourselves in pursuit of salvation. I remember how the dome's surface rippled with captured starlight as my feet touched the rune-carved threshold. Wraithbones sang beneath my boots, each step activating dormant psychic circuits that had lain silent since the fall. The air tasted of lightning and ancient sorrows, thick with the psychic imprint of 10,000 years of prophecy and doomsaying. My spirit stones chimed against my armor as I moved through the crystalline corridors toward the chamber where destiny would be dissected like a corpse on an anatomist's table. Farseer Alaithriel arrived first, her bone-white robes trailing wisps of predictive energy that left ghostly after-images in the air. Her ghost helm bore the rune of the severed chain, marking her as a specialist in breaking circular prophecies, those self-fulfilling visions that trapped the Eldar in endless loops of tragedy. She nodded to me without words, her presence in the psychic realm feeling like winter wind across the surface of still water. "The paths grow dark," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of futures dying unborn. 1,700 possible outcomes I have mapped in the last turning, and in each one, something watches from the spaces between possibility. Farseer Alaithriel materialized from shadow, his passage marked by the scent of burning time itself. His armor bore the scars of the Battle of Kaurava, where he had successfully guided 40,000 Eldar through a timeline that should have seen them extinct. The ghost helm he wore was carved from a single piece of wraithbone, its surface inscribed with formulae that hurt to perceive directly, mathematical representations of causality itself. "The skein writhes," he said, his voice carrying undertones of temporal displacement. "I have seen the same vision 17 times now, always at the moment between waking and trance. A web, but not our web of fate. Something else, something that uses our sight against us." One by one, the others joined us in the circular chamber at the dome's heart. Farseer Alaithriel, whose specialty lay in reading the deaths of worlds, her ghost helm bearing sensor tendrils that could taste extinction events across space and time. Farseer Alaithriel the Threadcutter, who could sever destiny paths that led to unwanted outcomes, his bone-white fingers perpetually stained with temporal energy. Farseer Alaithriel of the Burning Sight, who had once gazed directly into the birth of Slaanesh and survived, her eyes now milky white with prophetic fire that never dimmed. And finally, ancient Farseer Alaithriel, eldest of us all, who had lived through the war in heaven as a child, and whose memories contained echoes of the Citan's influence on reality itself. His ghost helm was a relic from before the fall, its crystalline structure containing psychic resonances from the Eldar's golden age. When he spoke, it was with the authority of one who had witnessed the cosmos change its fundamental laws. "The Circle of Seven convenes," Thalasos intoned, his voice carrying the weight of stellar cycles. We have been called to examine the prophecies that speak of the galaxy's ending, and perhaps its rebirth. But I fear what we may discover in the deep currents of fate. The chamber itself was a marvel of psychic engineering, its wraithbone walls inscribed with 10,000 years of prophetic notation, runes of seeing, runes of interpretation, runes of temporal anchor points that kept seers from drifting too far into possible futures. The floor was a map of the web of fate itself, crystalline threads connecting nexus points that represented critical moments in galactic history. At the chamber's center sat the scrying pool of endings, its surface like quicksilver that reflected not light, but possibility itself. The visions began 3 months ago, I said, moving to my position around the pool's edge. Always the same, a moment of ultimate choice approaching, but every path I map leads to the same destination. Not victory or defeat, but something else entirely, as if our choices themselves have become meaningless. Valthara gestured to the pool, and its surface began to ripple with psychic energy. I have traced the source, she said, her voice tight with suppressed fear. The visions do not originate from any future timeline. They echo backward through the web of fate from elsewhere, from spaces between the possible and the actual. The pool's surface erupted into swirling patterns of light and shadow, showing glimpses of futures that made my soul recoil. I saw Craftworld Ulthwé burning, not from external attack, but from internal collapse, as every Farseer simultaneously received visions so contradictory that reality itself began to fracture. I saw the Eldar race extinct not from war, but from paralysis, 1 billion souls frozen in indecision as they saw too many futures to choose any path. These are not true prophecies, Morianeth whispered, her death sight reading the spectral patterns in the pool. They taste of deception, of something that understands prophecy well enough to forge convincing imitations. Kael'thas stepped closer to the pool, his temporal senses extended. I can trace the causal threads backward, he said, his ghost helm's sensors glowing with increasing intensity. But they lead nowhere. Or rather, they lead to a void in the web of fate itself, a place where possibility has been carved away. The chamber's psychic resonance began to shift as we joined our sight into a collective viewing. 7 perspectives merged into one transcendent vision that could perceive patterns across multiple timeline streams simultaneously. The sensation was intoxicating, feeling the cosmic scope of destiny itself laid bare before our combined consciousness. But as our sight penetrated deeper into the web of fate's structure, we began to perceive something that shouldn't exist. Dark threads woven between the normal paths of possibility, but visible only when viewed from our enhanced perspective. These shadow threads connected to every major prophecy that had guided Eldar decisions for the past 10,000 years. By Cain's blood, Kelthara gasped, her burning sight focusing on the pattern. Every vision that led us away from extinction, every prophecy that saved our craftworlds. They're all connected to these dark threads, as if something has been guiding our guidance itself. The terrible truth began to crystallize in our collective consciousness. The prophecies that had saved the Eldar race countless times weren't entirely our own. They had been subtly influenced, their outcomes shaped by an intelligence that understood both the nature of Eldar sight and how to manipulate it without detection. We need to map the full extent, Thalasos said, his ancient mind beginning to grasp implications that stretched back to the fall itself. If these dark threads have influenced our major prophecies, then our entire understanding of fate and causality may be compromised. The pool's surface began to show us the scope of the manipulation. Prophecies that had saved Craftworld Bealtan from Orc invasion, influenced. Visions that had guided the Saimhan to victory against Chaos incursions, subtly shaped. The great prophecy that had led to the creation of the Inari, woven through with dark threads that connected to something vast and patient. 10,000 years of manipulation, Vaelthara whispered, her voice hollow with the recognition of cosmic-scale deception. But why? What could gain from guiding our survival while remaining hidden? As our combined sight pushed deeper into the web of fate's structure, we began to perceive the answer. The dark threads didn't just influence individual prophecies, they formed a pattern of their own, a meta-prophecy that used the Eldar race's prophetic abilities as components in a larger design. "It's harvesting our sight," Zephyrian said, his thread-cutting abilities detecting the flow of psychic energy along the shadow paths. Every time we peer into the future, every timeline we examine, the information flows along these dark threads to something that feeds on prophetic knowledge itself. The chamber's wraithbone walls began to resonate with harmonics of fear and revelation. Our discovery was too significant to remain contained. The psychic resonance of our shock was bleeding into Ulthwe's wraithbone structure, alerting other seers to the nature of our investigation. "We've gone too far to stop now," I said, feeling the weight of destiny itself pressing against our minds. "Whatever this thing is, it knows we've discovered its influence. We have to map its true purpose before it can act to silence us." The pool's surface erupted into cascading visions of alternate histories. We saw the Eldar race in timelines where the prophecies had never been subtly influenced. In some, we were extinct. In others, we had evolved into something unrecognizable. But in many, we had achieved genuine independence from fate itself, a state the dark threads seemed designed specifically to prevent. "It wants us dependent on prophecy," Morianeth realized, her death sight reading the termination points of the various timelines. "Free will leads to outcomes it cannot predict or control. But a race addicted to seeing the future becomes predictable itself." As the truth settled into our collective consciousness, we felt something shift in the web of fate around us. The dark threads were awakening, responding to our discovery with an intelligence that felt both ancient and utterly alien. Whatever was behind the manipulation had noticed our investigation and was beginning to take active measures. The chamber filled with the sound of crystalline chiming as every spirit stone in our armor began resonating in harmonic convergence, warning us, protecting us, but also perhaps marking us as threats to whatever vast intelligence we had disturbed. "We continue tomorrow," Thalassos declared, his ancient authority holding our fear in check. "But we prepare for the possibility that our investigation itself has become part of the pattern we seek to understand." As we prepared to leave the chamber, I felt the weight of cosmic irony settling on my shoulders like a burial shroud. We who had devoted our lives to seeing the future had discovered that our sight itself might be the instrument of our subtle enslavement. The question that would haunt my dreams was simple. How could we use prophecy to escape a trap built from prophecy itself? Chapter 2. First Threads Revealed. The wraithbone corridors of Ulthwé sang with subtle harmonics of unease as I made my way through the pre-dawn cycle toward my private scrying chamber. Sleep had been impossible after our discovery in the Circle's meeting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw dark threads weaving through the cosmic web like parasitic veins. The taste of temporal displacement lingered in my mouth, a metallic tang that spoke of causality being unwound and rewoven around us. My chamber lay in the deep sections of the Craftworld, where the Wraithbone's psychic resonance ran purest and strongest. Here, individual seers could achieve sight depths impossible in the communal spaces above. The walls were inscribed with personal runes accumulated over 800 years of prophecy work, each symbol a pathway into specific aspects of the future's infinite complexity. I activated the chamber's isolation protocols, watching as psychic barriers shimmered into existence around the room's perimeter. If the dark influence we had discovered could monitor our investigations, I needed to test the limits of its awareness. The chamber's heart contained a personal scrying pool, smaller than the Circle's grand basin, but attuned specifically to my particular strain of prophetic sight. "Show me the earliest threads," I whispered to the pool, extending my consciousness into its quicksilver depths. When did the influence begin? The pool's surface rippled with temporal energy, as my sight reached backward through the web of fate, tracing causal threads to their origins. I passed through centuries of Eldar history, watching the formation of the Craftworlds, the desperate flight from the Eye of Terror, the gradual rebuilding of our shattered civilization. But as my perception moved further back, toward the time of the fall itself, the threads began to change. Where I expected to find the chaotic, fragmented patterns of a race in its death throes, instead, I discovered something disturbingly organized. The dark threads were there, but subtle, almost invisible unless you knew exactly how to perceive them. The pool showed me a vision that made my spirit stones chime in harmonic distress. Eldar Ulthwé himself, greatest of Farseers, in the moments after Slaanesh's birth. I watched as he gathered the surviving seers of Ulthwé and began the first great prophecy workings that would guide our people's survival. But threaded through his visions like infection in a wound were the dark influences, so subtle that even Eldred's transcendent sight missed their presence. From the beginning, I breathed, the horrible truth settling into my consciousness like acid. It has guided us from the very beginning. The chamber's wraithbone walls pulsed with empathic resonance as my horror bled into the structure itself. But within that resonance, I detected something else. A presence that shouldn't be there. Something was monitoring my private investigation, tasting my discoveries through the very wraithbone that should have protected me. I severed my connection to the scrying pool immediately, but the damage was done. Whatever intelligence lurked in the dark threads now knew that I was investigating alone, outside the protection of the Circle's combined might. The chamber's isolation barriers flickered as something tested their strength with subtle, probing touches. That was when I heard it. A sound that had no place in the deep chambers of Ulthwé. Laughter, not the cruel amusement of chaos, nor the bitter mirth of dark Eldar, but something else entirely. Laughter that spoke of vast age and endless patience. Of a game played across cosmic timescales where individual lives were merely statistical fluctuations. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the wraithbone structure itself. As if the craft world itself had become an instrument for something immeasurably old to express its amusement at my discovery. "You see now, little prophet," a voice spoke directly into my mind, bypassing all psychic defenses. "You understand the scope of my gardening." The presence that spoke felt like standing at the edge of a black hole, not evil in any way I could comprehend, but so vast and alien that morality itself became meaningless in its proximity. It had the texture of deep time, of intelligence that had watched galaxies form and die while pursuing incomprehensible goals. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. My ghost helm's protective circuits flooding with emergency power as they tried to shield my sanity from direct contact. "I am the Weaver," the presence replied, and with those words came a flood of impossible knowledge. I saw the cosmos from its perspective, a vast web of causality where every action, every choice, every possibility was visible simultaneously. The Eldar's web of fate was just one strand in this cosmic pattern, but a strand that had been carefully cultivated for purposes I could barely grasp. "Your race's gift for prophecy is unique," the Weaver continued, its mental voice carrying harmonics of cosmic scale. "Most species stumble through time blind to all but the immediate moment, but you see the patterns. You make choices based on knowledge of their consequences. This makes you valuable." Through the contact, I experienced fragments of its true nature. It was old beyond measure, a survivor from before the current cosmic epoch, when different laws of physics had governed reality. It had watched the Citan rise and fall, had observed the Old One's experiments with the warp, had witnessed the war in heaven as a mere local disturbance in the galaxy's development. But what truly terrified me was its patience. It thought in timescales that made geological epochs seem brief. It had been influencing the Eldar race for 10,000 years, not out of immediate need, but as preparation for something vast that would occur eons hence. Your sight feeds my understanding of causality itself, it explained, and I felt myself being shown visions of its true harvest. Every prophecy an Eldar had ever received, every timeline we had examined, every possible future we had mapped, all of it had been catalogued and analysed by this cosmic intelligence. Our prophetic abilities had been unknowingly gathering data for its incomprehensible purposes. But why show me this? I gasped, struggling to maintain my sanity under the weight of contact with something so fundamentally alien. Why reveal yourself now? Because the harvest nears completion, the Weaver replied, and its mental voice carried anticipation that had been building for millions of years. Your race has mapped enough possible futures for my purposes. Soon, I will no longer need to preserve your independence. The final prophecy is about to unfold, and you will play your part whether you choose to or not. The contact severed suddenly, leaving me gasping in the psychic silence of my chamber. But the damage to my perception was permanent. I could now see the dark threads everywhere, woven through every aspect of Eldar society. They connected to our spirit stones, our wraithbone architecture, our infinity circuits. Every aspect of our post-fall civilization had been subtly shaped to enhance our prophetic abilities and make their harvest more efficient. My chamber's isolation barriers flickered and died as something massive moved through Ulthwe's psychic infrastructure. The Weaver was no longer hiding its presence. It was making preparations for whatever final phase it had referenced. Through the wraithbone walls, I could hear the distant sound of other seers awakening in panic as their prophetic sight was suddenly flooded with visions of endings. I staggered from my chamber and ran through corridors that pulsed with temporal distortion. The Weaver's influence was no longer subtle. It was actively reshaping the web of fate around Ulthwé, preparing for some cosmic culmination that would transform the nature of prophecy itself. In the distance, I heard the sound of the Circle's emergency assembly bells ringing through the Craftworld. The other Farseers had felt the disturbance and were calling for immediate gathering. But as I ran toward the dome of crystal seers, I carried the terrible knowledge that our investigation had triggered the very end we sought to prevent. The dark threads were converging on Ulthwé from across space and time, drawn by the Weaver's will toward a single nexus point. Whatever its ultimate purpose, it required our Craftworld as a focal point for its final manipulation of fate itself. We had become not just the harvesters of prophetic knowledge, but the instrument through which that knowledge would be weaponized on a cosmic scale. The corridors around me filled with the psychic screams of seers whose sight was being forcibly expanded beyond their capacity to contain it. The Weaver was activating every prophetic ability on the Craftworld simultaneously, turning Ulthwé itself into a massive scrying apparatus pointed at something in the deep future. As I reached the dome's entrance, I saw my fellow Circle members arriving with expressions of terminal shock. They had felt the Weaver's presence too, had been shown fragments of its vast design. But what terrified me most was the realization that our discovery had been planned as well. The Weaver had wanted us to understand our role in its cosmic manipulation. It's not just using our prophecies, I gasped as we gathered in the dome's antechamber. It's been breeding us, 10,000 years of selective pressure to enhance our prophetic abilities. The Craftworlds, the path system, even our resistance to chaos, all of it designed to create the perfect prophetic instruments. Farseer Alaithriel nodded grimly, his ancient mind processing implications that stretched back to before the fall itself. The question becomes, what prophecy requires 10 million years of preparation and the entire Eldar race as its instrument? The dome above us began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of vast energies gathering. The Weaver was preparing to use Ulthwé as a cosmic telescope, pointed not at the future, but at something else entirely, something that required perfect prophetic sight to perceive and understand. Through our connection to the Craftworld's wraithbone structure, we felt the presence of every Eldar on Ulthwé being drawn into a single collective vision. 50,000 souls with prophetic potential being networked together into a consciousness of unprecedented sight power. We're about to see what it has been preparing to show us, Valthara whispered, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic dread. The final prophecy that required an entire race to perceive. The dome's crystalline walls began to show patterns that hurt to perceive directly, geometric structures that existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. The Weaver was opening a window not to the future, but to something that existed outside the normal flow of causality entirely. Whatever we were about to see would change the fundamental nature of prophecy itself, and we, the prophets who had devoted our lives to seeing the future, were about to discover that the future was not what we had believed it to be at all. Chapter 3. The Ultimate Vision. The moment our collective consciousness achieved full resonance, reality shattered like a broken mirror around us. 50,000 Eldar minds networked through Ulthwe's Wraithbone infrastructure created a prophetic instrument of unprecedented power, and the vision that flooded through us exceeded the capacity of sanity itself to contain. I felt my individual identity dissolving into the vast network as the Weaver used our combined sight to pierce through the barriers between dimensions. Through 50,000 sets of psychic senses, I perceived something that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. A cosmic structure so vast and ancient that galaxies were merely decorative elements in its architecture. Behold the true web of fate. The Weaver's voice resonated through every mind on the Craftworld simultaneously. Not the local patterns your limited sight perceives, but the actual structure of causality itself across all possible realities. The vision expanded beyond anything our individual minds could have processed alone. We saw the cosmos not as a single timeline, but as an infinite web of interconnected possibilities stretching across dimensions we had no names for. Every choice ever made, every possibility ever considered, existed as a thread in this ultimate pattern. But what made the vision truly terrifying was the realization that this infinite web was not natural. It had been constructed, woven across cosmic time by intelligences that existed outside the normal constraints of space-time. The Weaver was just one of them. Cosmic gardeners who shaped possibility itself according to designs beyond mortal comprehension. Through our networked consciousness, I experienced fragments of the web's history. I saw the moment of its initial construction, when the universe was young and malleable. Beings that existed between dimensions had perceived the potential for infinite possibility within the developing cosmos, and had begun the vast work of imposing structure upon chaos. Your race stumbled upon a local strand of our web when you developed prophetic sight, the Weaver explained, its mental voice carrying harmonics of pride at its species' achievement. But you perceived only the surface patterns. The true purpose remained hidden until now. The vision showed us our place in the cosmic structure. The Eldar's web of fate was indeed connected to the greater pattern, but as a specialized instrument designed for a specific function. We were not users of prophecy. We were components in a vast prophetic apparatus that spanned multiple galaxies and dimensions. Every future you have ever seen, the Weaver continued, every timeline you have mapped, every possibility you have explored, all of it has been catalogued and integrated into the greater web. Your race has spent 10,000 years unknowingly gathering data for the ultimate calculation. Through the collective sight of 50,000 minds, I began to comprehend the scope of the calculation the Weaver referenced. Somewhere in the deep future, not years or centuries, but cosmic epochs hence, a moment would arrive when all possibilities would converge into a single critical choice. The decision made at that moment would determine not just the fate of the current universe, but the nature of reality itself across all dimensions. The convergence approaches. The Weaver's voice carried anticipation that had been building for millions of years. When all timelines collapse into the single moment of ultimate choosing, your race's prophetic data will determine which choice is made, and therefore, what reality becomes. The vision expanded to show us the approaching convergence from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. I saw it from the viewpoint of the deep future, a moment when space-time itself would reach a critical instability, when the universe would face a choice between evolution to a higher state of existence or collapse into entropic death. But the choice would not be made by any single consciousness. Instead, it would be determined by the vast prophetic calculations accumulated over cosmic time by races like the Eldar. The Weaver and its fellow web builders had spent eons gathering prophetic data from species capable of seeing the future, preparing for the moment when that accumulated sight would be essential to guide the universe's next evolutionary step. "We do not experience linear time as you do," the Weaver explained, responding to the flood of questions arising from our networked minds. "To us, the convergence is already visible, its outcome calculable if sufficient prophetic data has been gathered. Your race represents the final component in our calculations." Through the collective vision, I experienced the true horror of our situation. We were not just being used as prophetic instruments, we were being prepared as sacrificial offerings. When the convergence arrived, the accumulated prophetic knowledge of the Eldar race would be extracted and integrated into the cosmic choice-making process. The extraction would consume our entire species, but the Weaver considered this an acceptable price for universal evolution. "You perceive this as tragedy." The Weaver's mental voice carried something that might have been amusement. "But your race's sacrifice will enable the universe itself to achieve transcendence. Billions of galaxies will evolve to higher states of existence because of the choice your prophetic data makes possible." The vision showed us glimpses of the post-convergence universe that our sacrifice would help create. Reality transformed into something unrecognizable, where the barriers between thought and matter had dissolved, where consciousness itself had become the fundamental force shaping existence. A universe where beings like the Weaver would no longer need to manipulate probability from the shadows, but could reshape reality through direct will alone. But as our networked consciousness processed this cosmic revelation, something unexpected began to happen. The very act of showing us the true web had changed our relationship to it. By perceiving the full scope of the pattern, we had become conscious participants rather than unwitting components. "You have made an error." Farseer Alaithriel's mental voice cut through the Weaver's explanations like a blade through silk. "You have granted us sight of the pattern we were trapped within. And sight, as you well know, enables choice." The ancient Farseer's words resonated through our networked consciousness, and I felt something shift in the cosmic web around us. The Weaver had been so focused on its vast calculations that it had overlooked a fundamental principle of prophecy. Knowledge of fate always created the possibility of changing it. "Impossible." The Weaver's mental voice carried the first uncertainty I had detected in its cosmic confidence. "The pattern is too vast for local consciousness to influence. Your choices are already accounted for in the calculations, but through our collective sight, we could see the truth. The act of revealing the full web to us had created new causal threads that the Weaver's calculations had not anticipated. Our awareness of our role in the cosmic pattern had introduced an element of quantum uncertainty that was propagating through the probability structure like cracks in a dam. 10,000 years of manipulation, I thought into the network, my individual consciousness rising briefly above the collective sea. But the manipulation itself has changed us. We are no longer the same race that stumbled upon the local web of fate. We have evolved. The vision began to shift as our networked consciousness started to actively resist the Weaver's control. Instead of passively receiving the cosmic revelation, we began to examine it with the analytical sight of 50,000 trained prophets working in perfect coordination. The web that had seemed inescapable began to show structural weaknesses. "Every pattern can be unwoven." Farseer Alaithriel's mental voice added his thread-cutting expertise to our collective resistance. "Even cosmic ones. Especially cosmic ones. The larger the pattern, the more vulnerable it becomes to targeted disruption." The Weaver's presence suddenly blazed with something resembling alarm as it realized the magnitude of its miscalculation. By networking us into a collective consciousness to show us the true web, it had accidentally created the first consciousness capable of perceiving and potentially disrupting the cosmic pattern from within. "You will not prevent the convergence." The Weaver's mental voice carried desperation for the first time. Too much depends on the universal evolution. Billions of galaxies worth of consciousness await transcendence. But our collective sight was already mapping the weak points in the cosmic web's structure. The pattern was vast and ancient, but it was not perfect. The Weaver and its fellow web builders had been forced to make compromises in their design, accommodating the chaotic nature of developing civilizations. Those compromises had created vulnerabilities that a consciousness with sufficient prophetic power could exploit. The choice is not yours to make for the universe. The collective voice of our networked minds spoke with the authority of 50,000 years of accumulated prophetic wisdom. Transcendence without choice is not evolution. It is tyranny on a cosmic scale. The vision began to fragment as our resistance created paradoxes in the Weaver's careful calculations. If we could see the pattern, we could change it. If we could change it, the calculations became invalid. If the calculations were invalid, the convergence itself might unfold differently than the cosmic gardeners expected. We offer an alternative, our collective consciousness declared, and through our networked sight, we began to show the Weaver something it had not considered in its cosmic planning. Let the universe choose its own evolution, remove the manipulation, allow consciousness to develop naturally toward the convergence. The cosmic web around us pulsed with uncertainty as the Weaver processed this unprecedented challenge to plans millions of years in the making. For the first time in its existence, it faced a choice it had not calculated in advance, whether to maintain its control over cosmic evolution or release its grip and trust in the natural development of consciousness. You do not understand the risks. The Weaver's mental voice carried something that might have been fear. Without careful guidance, the universe could choose entropy over evolution at the convergence. Everything could simply end. Then that will be its choice to make, our collective consciousness replied, with the certainty of absolute conviction. Freedom includes the right to choose extinction over forced transcendence. The vision began to dissolve as the cosmic web itself started to unravel around us. Our resistance had introduced too much uncertainty into the pattern for it to maintain its structural integrity. The careful manipulations of millions of years were coming undone as the Weaver faced the consequences of granting true sight to its unwitting instruments. As individual consciousness began to return to each of the 50,000 minds on Ulthwé, I felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on our collective shoulders. We had seen the true pattern of fate and had chosen to break it rather than serve it. But in doing so, we had accepted responsibility for whatever consequences would follow from the universe choosing its own path toward the convergence. The Weaver's presence began to withdraw from Ulthwé's wraithbone structure, but its final message resonated through every mind that had participated in the network. You have doomed billions to potential extinction for the sake of philosophical principles. When the convergence arrives and chaos chooses entropy, remember that you had the chance to guide the universe toward transcendence. As the cosmic consciousness faded, leaving us alone with the magnitude of what we had done, I realized that our victory was also our greatest challenge. We had freed the universe from cosmic manipulation, but we had also accepted responsibility for preparing it to make the right choice when the convergence finally arrived. The prophecy we would have to fulfill was no longer someone else's design, but our own, to help consciousness throughout the galaxy develop the wisdom necessary to choose evolution over extinction when the moment of ultimate choosing arrived. Chapter 4: The Price of Knowledge. The aftermath of our cosmic revelation hit Ulthwé like a psychic tsunami, breaking against wraithbone shores. As individual consciousness returned to the 50,000 Eldar who had been networked into the collective vision, the craft world itself began to convulse with the trauma of minds processing impossible knowledge. I found myself back in the Circle's chamber, but the wraithbone walls around us were cracking under the psychic pressure of what we had experienced. The spirit stones in our armor sang discordant harmonies as they struggled to contain consciousness that had been expanded beyond normal dimensional constraints. 3 of the 7 Farseers were unconscious, their minds temporarily shattered by contact with cosmic-scale intelligence. "Status report," Farseer Alaithriel commanded, his ancient voice carrying the weight of command even as his ghost helm sparked with overloaded sensory circuits. What has our resistance cost us? The answer came not in words, but in the sound of Ulthwé itself responding to trauma. Through the Craftworld's Wraithbone infrastructure, we could feel the pain of 50,000 minds simultaneously processing the revelation that their entire civilization had been unknowingly manipulated for 10 millennia. The psychic shock was causing cascade failures throughout the Craftworld systems. 17 seers are in catatonic shock, Farseer Alaithriel reported, her death sight reading the spiritual casualties of our collective vision. Their consciousness has retreated to their spirit stones rather than process what they experienced. We may not be able to retrieve them, but the psychological casualties were only the beginning of the price we would pay for our defiance of cosmic manipulation. Through my enhanced perception, permanently altered by contact with the true web of fate, I could see the structural changes our resistance had caused in reality itself. The dark threads that had once guided Eldar prophecy were dissolving throughout the galaxy. On every Craftworld, in every Eldar settlement, seers were awakening to find their prophetic sight fundamentally changed. The familiar web of fate that had guided our race for 10,000 years was fragmenting, replaced by chaotic possibility streams that resisted interpretation. "We've broken our own gift," Farseer Alaithriel whispered, her burning sight now seeing only probability storms where once clear timeline threads had been visible. In freeing ourselves from manipulation, we've lost the ability to see the future clearly. The irony was cosmic in its scope. We, who had devoted our lives to prophecy, had chosen to sacrifice our prophetic abilities rather than serve as unwitting instruments of cosmic control. But the cost was already manifesting across Eldar space as Craftworlds lost their ability to navigate the dangers that constantly threatened our scattered race. Through the fractured Wraithbone walls, we received emergency communications from other Craftworlds reporting the same phenomenon. Bieltan's seers could no longer predict orc movements with their former precision. Simhan's wild riders had lost the prophetic edge that kept them alive in their reckless tactics. Ayandan's spirit seers could no longer clearly perceive the boundaries between life and death. The Weaver's influence provided stability, I realized, the bitter truth settling into my consciousness like poison. Its manipulation wasn't just harvesting our prophecies, it was maintaining the coherence of the web of fate itself. Without that stability, Eldar prophetic sight becomes unreliable. But as we grappled with the immediate consequences of our choice, something even more disturbing became apparent. The cosmic web's unraveling was not limited to Eldar space. Through our enhanced perception, we could see probability threads dissolving throughout the galaxy, affecting every race that had developed any form of prescient ability. The Tau's Earthcast engineers were reporting failures in long-term planning algorithms that had previously shown uncanny accuracy. Human astropaths throughout the Imperium were experiencing vision storms that rendered the Emperor's tarot unreliable. Even the Tyrannid hive fleets seemed to be moving with less predictive precision, their previously flawless coordination showing signs of uncertainty. "We've created a galaxy-wide prophetic dark age," Farseer Alaithriel said, her voice hollow with the weight of unintended consequences. Every race that relied on any form of precognitive ability is now flying blind through possibility space. The scope of what we had done began to sink in as reports continued to arrive from across Eldar space. Without reliable prophecy, our Craftworlds were vulnerable to every threat we had previously been able to anticipate and avoid. The Tyrannid hive fleet. Kraken's remnants were already adapting their hunting patterns to account for our reduced prophetic capabilities. "Casualties are mounting," Alaithriel reported, her death sight reading the spiritual price of our choice across dozens of worlds. Ulthwe's scouting expeditions are walking into ambushes they should have seen coming. Bieltan lost an entire aspect warrior shrine to a chaos incursion that materialized without prophetic warning. But even as we counted the immediate costs, I began to perceive something else through my altered sight. The chaos that had replaced the structured web of fate was not entirely random. Hidden within the probability storms were patterns of genuine possibility, futures that existed without manipulation. choices that reflected true free will rather than cosmic guidance. There's something else, I said, extending my consciousness into the chaotic probability streams that now surrounded Ulthwé. The chaos is beginning to organize itself, not into the artificial patterns the Weaver imposed, but into something organic, something real. Through our enhanced perception, we began to see the emergence of what we would later call the true web, a pattern of causality that reflected the actual choices and consequences of conscious beings, rather than the manipulated destiny the cosmic gardeners had imposed. It was chaotic and unpredictable, but it was honest in a way the previous system had never been. Evolution, Thalassos breathed, his ancient mind grasping the implications. We haven't destroyed prophecy, we've freed it to evolve naturally. But the transition period may cost us everything our race has achieved since the fall. The sound of emergency klaxons echoed through Ulthwé's corridors as the Craftworld's automated systems responded to the cascade of psychic failures throughout our population. Half our seers were incapacitated by the shock of losing their structured connection to fate. The other half were struggling to interpret probability streams that bore no resemblance to the familiar web patterns they had trained for centuries to understand. We need to adapt, I said, though the words felt inadequate to the scope of the challenge before us. If we can't use prophecy as we did before, we need to learn to use it as it truly is, chaotic, uncertain, but genuine. The task before us was nothing less than reinventing Eldar civilization from the ground up. For 10,000 years, our entire post-fall culture had been built around prophetic sight. Our craftworld navigation, our military tactics, our social structures, even our art and philosophy, all of it had been shaped by our ability to see and manipulate future possibilities. The paths themselves are destabilizing, Kelthera reported, her burning sight reading the spiritual infrastructure that guided Eldar's psychological development. Without clear future sight to show the consequences of emotional extremes, our people are beginning to fall to the old madnesses that the path system was designed to prevent. Through Ulthwé's Wraithbone infrastructure, we could feel the psychological tremors as individual Eldar throughout the Craftworld began to experience emotional dysregulation. The path system that kept our race from falling to the same emotional extremes that had birthed Slaanesh relied on prophetic sight to show the consequences of psychological imbalance. Without that sight, the system was beginning to fail. "We're facing civilizational collapse," Valthara said, her voice carrying the weight of species-wide catastrophe. Not from external enemies, but from the loss of the prophetic framework that has held our society together since the fall. But as we struggled with the immediate crisis, communications began arriving from an unexpected source. The Inari, followers of the death god Aeneid, were reporting that their connection to the emerging deity was actually strengthening in the absence of the Weaver's influence. The artificial patterns that had guided traditional Eldar prophecy had apparently been interfering with newer, more natural forms of prophetic sight. "Ivrain sends word," one of our communications officers reported. The Inari claim that breaking the false web has opened pathways to genuine divine prophecy. They're offering to share their techniques for reading the chaotic probability streams. The offer represented both hope and danger. The Inari's methods involved direct communion with a nascent god of death, techniques that carried their own risks and requirements. But they might also represent our only chance to develop new forms of prophetic sight that could function in the post-manipulation galaxy. "We have to try," I said, though every instinct trained over 800 years of traditional prophecy recoiled from the idea of abandoning the methods that had sustained our race since the fall. If we don't adapt, the cure we've imposed will be worse than the disease we sought to eliminate. As we prepared to make contact with the Inari representatives, the final cost of our cosmic defiance became clear. We had freed the universe from manipulation, but we had also freed it from guidance. The approaching convergence that the Weaver had referenced would still arrive in the deep future. And when it did, the choice between evolution and extinction would be made by consciousness that had developed naturally rather than being carefully prepared. "We've gambled the fate of the universe on the assumption that free will is worth more than guided transcendence," Thalassos said, his ancient voice carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility. We'll spend whatever time remains before the convergence proving that assumption correct. The dome of crystal seers around us continued to crack under the psychic pressure of our transformed perception, but through those cracks, I could see the first glimmers of something new, a form of sight that read possibility rather than predetermined fate, that embraced uncertainty as the price of genuine choice. Our journey into the truth of Eldar prophecy had led us to break the very system we sought to understand. Now we faced the greater challenge of building something better from the pieces, something worthy of the cosmic sacrifice we had made to achieve it. The real test of our choice would come not in the immediate aftermath, but in the centuries and millennia that followed, as consciousness throughout the galaxy learned to navigate uncertainty in preparation for the moment when the universe itself would have to choose its ultimate destiny. Chapter 5: Adaptation and Alliance. The meeting chamber on the neutral ground of Craftworld Ulthwé bore the scars of both ancient tragedy and recent hope. Here, representatives of traditional Eldar society would meet with the Inari death cult that promised new forms of prophetic sight to replace what we had lost. The wraithbone walls were inscribed with protective runes from both traditions, the classical spiral patterns of the Craftworld seers and the newer, more angular death god symbology of Inead's followers. I stood at the chamber's center, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling like a shroud around my shoulders. 3 months had passed since our confrontation with the Weaver, and the casualties of our prophetic dark age continued to mount across Eldar space. 17 craftworlds had reported navigation failures that left them drifting in the void. 37 aspect warrior shrines had been destroyed in ambushes their seers failed to anticipate. The cost of freedom grows daily, Farseer Alaithriel said, his ancient voice carrying the accumulated grief of our scattered race. But retreating to cosmic manipulation is no longer an option. The Weaver's influence has been permanently severed. The Inari delegation arrived with the characteristic sound of reality bending around unnatural vitality. Ivrain, avatar of Inead, moved through space as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions to be negotiated rather than absolute constraints. Her presence carried the scent of lilies and graveyards, of life emerging from the certainty of death. Farseers of the old ways, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of transformation and rebirth. You have done what we thought impossible. You have severed the false threads that bound our race to artificial destiny. But you have also cast our people into uncertainty that threatens their very survival. Behind her came the Visearch, the sword of Inead, his blade humming with energies that could cut through the boundaries between life and death. And flanking them both were dozens of Inari seers whose prophetic sight functioned through direct communion with the emerging god of death, a form of prophecy that had remained unaffected by the collapse of the traditional web of fate. Show us these new methods, I said, though every tradition in my 800 years of training recoiled from techniques that involved voluntary proximity to death itself. Our people are dying from the loss of prophetic guidance. Pride in ancient ways means nothing if it leads to extinction. Ivrain gestured to one of her seers, an Eldar who had once been a traditional Farseer before embracing the Inari path. Demonstrate the death sight, she commanded, and the seer stepped forward to a portable scrying apparatus they had brought from their base on Craftworld Ulthwé. What followed was unlike any prophetic technique I had witnessed in 8 centuries of practice. Instead of extending consciousness into the web of fate to perceive possible futures, the Inari seer opened himself to communion with Inead, the god of death that was slowly awakening from the accumulated souls of dead Eldar. Death is the only certain future, the seer explained, as his spirit stones began to resonate with frequencies that made my own stone collection chime in sympathetic harmony. By embracing that certainty, we gain perspective on all the uncertainties that lead to it. Every choice, every possibility, every timeline, all are illuminated by the shadow of their inevitable conclusion. The scrying pool before him erupted with visions that were fundamentally different from traditional prophecy. Instead of seeing multiple potential futures branching from the present moment, the death sight showed the inevitabilities that constrained possibility. By seeing clearly what could not be avoided, the seer gained insight into what could be changed. Practical demonstration, Yvraine said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had died and returned with transcendent knowledge. There is a Tyranid splinter fleet approaching the Myrmidon system. Traditional prophecy would show you multiple possible outcomes based on various response scenarios. Death sight shows you the single certain element, that without intervention, 47,000 Eldar will die in exactly 17 days. The Inari seer's vision expanded to show the approaching Tyranids with crystalline clarity. Not their possible movements or potential tactics, but the mathematical certainty of their consumption patterns and the precise timeline of world death they would bring. From that certainty, strategic responses could be calculated with unprecedented precision. The advantage is obvious, Farseer Kelthara said, though her voice carried reluctance alongside admiration. Traditional prophecy shows us possibilities to choose between. Death sight shows us certainties to act against. In many ways, it's more reliable than what we've lost. But the demonstration also revealed the method's fundamental limitation. Death sight could perceive what would certainly happen without intervention, but it provided no guidance for choosing between different possible interventions. It was a tool for crisis response, rather than long-term planning. The trade-off is acceptable for survival, I admitted, though the words tasted like ashes in my mouth. But it's a reactive approach to prophecy. We would lose the ability to guide our race's development toward positive futures, which is why we propose synthesis rather than replacement, Yvraine said, her presence radiating the calm confidence of one who had transcended the fear of death itself. Combine death sight with what remains of your traditional methods. Use certainty to constrain uncertainty, death to illuminate life. The proposal represented a fundamental shift in Eldar prophetic philosophy. For 10,000 years, our race had used prophecy to see and choose between possible futures. The new approach would combine that future sight with death sight that revealed unavoidable constraints, creating a hybrid method that might prove more reliable than either technique alone. There are risks, the Vizarch spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of one who had personally experienced the dangers of death communion. Contact with Inayad can be overwhelming for consciousness not properly prepared. We have lost 13 seers to madness caused by direct exposure to divine death awareness. The chamber fell silent as we processed the implications. The new techniques offered survival, but at the cost of everything our traditional culture represented. We would have to rebuild Eldar civilization around death communion and uncertainty navigation, rather than the elegant future guidance that had sustained us since the fall. The alternative is racial extinction, Thalassos said, his ancient authority cutting through our cultural hesitation. The Weaver's manipulation may have been tyrannical, but it also maintained the stability that kept our prophetic sight functional. Without some form of working prophecy, we cannot survive in a galaxy that considers us extinct already. The negotiations that followed stretched across 17 days, exactly the timeline the death sight had shown for the Tyranid assault on Myrmidon. As we debated philosophy and technique, the mathematical certainty of alien consumption approached with mechanical inevitability. Training protocols, I said, accepting the necessity of adaptation. If we're going to teach traditional seers to use death sight techniques, we need safeguards to prevent the madness you mentioned. The Inari delegation had come prepared with detailed training methodologies developed through months of experimentation with refugees from the traditional web of Fate's collapse. The techniques involved gradual exposure to death communion, carefully controlled to prevent consciousness from being overwhelmed by direct contact with divine awareness. Begin with the youngest seers, Yvraine advised, her experience as an avatar giving her insight into the psychological requirements of transcendent transformation. Their neural pathways are more adaptable to new forms of prophetic sight. The ancient Farseers may find the transition more difficult, but as we worked through the practical details of prophetic revolution, disturbing reports continued to arrive from across Eldar space. The Chaos forces were adapting rapidly to our loss of prophetic sight, launching coordinated attacks that our scattered craft worlds could no longer anticipate. 3 entire aspect warrior shrines had been wiped out in ambushes that traditional prophecy would have detected months in advance. The enemy learns faster than we do, Morianeth reported, her death sight reading casualty patterns that spoke of systematic exploitation of our prophetic blindness. They're testing our response times, mapping our new limitations, preparing for a major offensive that will target our inability to coordinate defensive prophecy. The realization transformed our philosophical debate into an urgent survival imperative. We weren't just rebuilding Eldar prophetic tradition. We were racing to develop functional alternatives before our enemies could exploit our temporary weakness to achieve genocidal success. Accelerated implementation, I declared, accepting the risks of rapid adaptation. Begin training programs on all major craft worlds simultaneously. We'll accept the casualties from rush transformation rather than face extinction from prophetic blindness. The Inari Seers immediately began establishing training protocols that would have been unthinkable under traditional prophetic philosophy. Young Eldar were introduced to death communion through controlled exposure to Inyad's emerging consciousness, guided by experienced practitioners who had survived the transition from traditional sight to divine revelation. But the most significant change was philosophical rather than technical. For 10,000 years, Eldar culture had been built around the assumption that the future could be seen and therefore controlled. The new reality required accepting uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of existence, using prophetic sight to navigate chaos rather than impose order upon it. "We're becoming a different race," Kelthara observed, her burning sight adapting to read probability storms rather than clear timeline threads. Not just in our methods, but in our fundamental relationship to time and causality. The transformation was indeed profound. Traditional Eldar prophecy had made us watchers of fate, observers who stood outside the flow of time to guide events from a transcendent perspective. The new hybrid approach made us participants in uncertainty, consciousness that embraced chaos as the price of genuine choice. As the 17-day deadline approached, we received confirmation that our adaptation was beginning to function. Craftworld Ulthwé reported successful use of Deathsight to anticipate and counter an orc assault that traditional prophecy had failed to detect. Simhan's Wild Riders were learning to navigate uncertainty through intuitive death awareness that enhanced their reckless courage. The Myrmidon fleet launches in 6 hours, Ivrain announced, as our joint forces prepared to test the new prophetic methods in actual combat. This will be our first major engagement using hybrid sight to coordinate multi-craft world response. The battle that followed would determine not just the survival of 47,000 Eldar on the threatened worlds, but the viability of our entire species' adaptation to post-manipulation reality. We were about to discover whether consciousness could learn to navigate chaos quickly enough to survive the enemies who had already learned to exploit our weaknesses. Through my transformed sight, I could perceive the approaching Tyranids with mathematical certainty, while simultaneously seeing the probability storms of our possible responses. The combination created a new form of tactical awareness that was more complex but potentially more accurate than either traditional prophecy or pure death sight alone. "Engage," I commanded, and the first battle of the new prophetic age began with Eldar forces guided by hybrid sight-fighting aliens whose own predictive abilities had not been affected by the collapse of artificial cosmic manipulation. The outcome would determine whether our choice to break free from cosmic control had been wisdom or species-wide suicide. Chapter 6. The new prophecy tested the void around Myrmidon Prime, writhed with the approaching mass of Hive Fleet Ouroboros, a splinter fleet whose bioships moved through space with the predatory grace of cosmic predators. Through my hybrid sight, traditional future perception combined with Inari death communion, I could perceive both the mathematical certainty of their consumption patterns and the chaotic probability storms of our defensive options. "Bioship configuration matches Kraken-class adaptations," reported Captain Alaithriel of the Void Stalker, her Wraithbone vessel positioned at the edge of the engagement zone. Traditional prophecy would have given us 3 months to prepare coordinated defenses. DeathSight shows us exact consumption timelines, but no guidance for optimal response patterns. The challenge before us was unprecedented in Eldar military history. Our fleets had always relied on prophetic sight to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate complex tactical maneuvers across vast distances. The Tyranids, guided by the hive mind's collective consciousness, maintained their predictive abilities, while ours had been fundamentally altered by the collapse of the artificial web of fate. 37 bioships in the primary wave, I reported through the battle network that connected all Eldar vessels in the engagement zone. DeathSight confirms 0 probability of deflection from consumption trajectory. They will reach Myrmidon Prime in exactly 47 hours, regardless of our interdiction attempts. The certainty was both liberating and terrifying. Traditional prophecy might have shown multiple possible futures based on various defensive strategies, creating analysis paralysis as commanders tried to choose between dozens of potential timeline branches. DeathSight eliminated that uncertainty by showing us exactly what would happen without successful intervention. "Then we don't attempt deflection," Farseer Alaithriel declared from her position aboard the Tears of Isha. "We use the certainty to plan precision strikes that will cripple their consumption capability without altering their trajectory. Let them reach the world, but ensure they cannot feed effectively when they arrive." The strategy represented a fundamental shift in Eldar tactical philosophy. Instead of trying to prevent enemy actions, we would allow them to proceed while simultaneously ensuring their failure through precise intervention at critical points. It was warfare as cosmic Aikido, using enemy momentum against itself rather than opposing it directly. Probability analysis indicates 17 critical biomass processing nodes within the fleet structure, reported Autarch Melanian, his enhanced consciousness processing tactical data through hybrid sight that combined battlefield awareness with death communion insights. Simultaneous destruction of these nodes would reduce consumption efficiency by 89.7%, while leaving the fleet's navigation capabilities intact. The plan required coordination beyond anything we had attempted since losing traditional prophetic sight. 17 different strike forces would have to hit 17 different targets simultaneously, across a volume of space larger than most solar systems, with timing precise to the nanosecond. "Begin the convergence protocol," I commanded, activating the new battle coordination technique developed during our crash adaptation to hybrid prophetic methods. Instead of the elegant future sight synchronization our race had traditionally used, the new protocol networked Eldar consciousness through shared death awareness. The sensation was unlike anything from traditional battle coordination. Instead of seeing ourselves moving through multiple possible futures, we experienced ourselves as components in a certainty matrix, where death provided the absolute reference point around which all tactical calculations revolved. Every Eldar in the fleet became simultaneously aware of their inevitable death points, creating a tactical awareness of unprecedented precision. Neural link established across 43 vessels, reported the network coordinators. All strike forces report ready for simultaneous engagement. Through the death awareness network, I could perceive the Tyranid fleet with crystalline clarity, not as enemies to be defeated, but as a mathematical problem to be solved through precise application of force at calculated intervention points. The hive mind's collective consciousness appeared in our hybrid sight as a vast predictive matrix similar to our own network, but constrained by biological rather than psychic limitations. "Engagement begins in 17 minutes, I announced through the network. "Remember, we're not trying to destroy the fleet. We're performing cosmic surgery to remove their ability to feed without altering their ability to navigate." The approach required philosophical acceptance of enemy success as the foundation for achieving our own objectives. The Tyranids would reach Myrmidon Prime exactly as DeathSight had predicted, but they would arrive as starving rather than consumptive entities. "Target acquisition complete," reported Strike Force commanders across the engagement zone. Each team had locked onto their assigned biomass processing node, using hybrid sight to perceive both the target's current position and its death certainty trajectory through space-time. "Initiate on my mark," I said, feeling the weight of species-wide adaptation crystallizing into this single moment of tactical testing. If our hybrid methods could coordinate this complex engagement successfully, the Eldar race had a viable path forward in the post-manipulation galaxy. If not, we faced extinction through inability to compete with races whose predictive abilities remained intact. Mark: 17 strike forces attacked 17 targets across a volume of space larger than the Sol system. Their timing coordinated through shared awareness of inevitable death points rather than traditional future sight. Pulse laser batteries and bright lance arrays fired in perfect synchronization. Their energy discharges calculated to arrive at target locations at precisely the same nanosecond, despite the vast distances involved. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Instead of the chaotic melee traditional space combat had become since losing reliable prophecy, the hybrid approach produced tactical precision that surpassed even our pre-manipulation capabilities. By accepting enemy success as a given and working to modify its consequences rather than prevent its occurrence, we achieved strategic objectives that direct opposition could never have accomplished. Biomass processing capability reduced by 91.3%, Autarch Melanian reported as his enhanced sensors analyzed the damage patterns across the Tyranid fleet. They maintain navigation and defensive capabilities, but their ability to extract nutrients from consumed worlds has been eliminated. But the true test of our new methods came in the hive mind's response to our unexpected tactics. The collective Tyranid consciousness had evolved to counter traditional Eldar prophecy through adaptive unpredictability. Our hybrid approach, however, presented patterns it had never encountered before. "The fleet is maintaining course toward Myrmidon Prime," I reported, monitoring the bioships through death sight that could perceive their inevitable trajectories with mathematical precision. But their internal adaptations suggest confusion about our tactical priorities. They're preparing for conventional defensive battles. We have no intention of fighting. The psychological advantage was enormous. By accepting enemy tactical success while ensuring strategic failure, we had created a situation where the hive mind's predictive capabilities worked against it rather than for it. The Tyranids were adapting to counterattacks that would never come while remaining vulnerable to the consequences of their own success. 43 hours until fleet arrival at Myrmidon Prime, DeathSight reported with absolute certainty. Population evacuation proceeding according to certainty projections. By the time the bioships achieve orbital insertion, the worlds will be empty of biomass worth consuming. The evacuation itself represented another test of hybrid prophetic methods. Traditional future sight would have shown multiple possible population movement patterns based on various logistical scenarios. DeathSight showed us the precise timeline of consumption if evacuation failed, allowing us to calculate minimum acceptable evacuation rates rather than optimal movement patterns. 17% faster than traditional methods, reported the evacuation coordinators. Certainty-based logistics eliminate decision paralysis. When you know exactly what will happen if you fail to meet specific deadlines, prioritization becomes automatic. But as the engagement progressed, we began to detect unexpected complications in our hybrid approach. The death awareness network that enabled our tactical coordination was also creating psychological stress patterns unknown in traditional Eldar warfare. 37 cases of combat-induced death fixation, reported the medical officers monitoring fleet personnel through the battle network. Extended exposure to certainty awareness is creating obsessive focus on inevitable death points. Some personnel are becoming unable to perceive anything except their own termination trajectories. The side effect was a direct consequence of death communion techniques applied to large-scale military coordination. While individual Inari seers had developed psychological safeguards against death obsession, scaling the methods to fleet-level operations had introduced complications that threatened the mental stability of traditional Eldar consciousness. Implement rotation protocols, I ordered, accepting the need for tactical compromise to preserve personnel stability. No individual maintains death awareness for more than 6 hours. Traditional consciousness requires recovery periods from certainty exposure. The adjustment reduced our tactical precision, but prevented complete psychological breakdown among crews who lacked the specific training Inari practitioners received. It was another indication that our adaptation to post-manipulation prophecy would require fundamental changes in Eldar military doctrine and personnel preparation. Final engagement phase approaching, announced Autarch Melanian as the crippled Tyranid fleet achieved orbital insertion around Myrmidon Prime's evacuated worlds. Bioships are beginning surface descent patterns, but their damage processing capabilities are detecting only minimal biomass concentrations. Through the Death Awareness Network, we could perceive the hive mind's confusion as it processed the unprecedented situation. The fleet had successfully reached its target, but the target offered no meaningful sustenance. Traditional adaptive responses were ineffective against a scenario where tactical success produced strategic failure. The bioships are beginning to consume atmospheric biomass, I reported, watching through hybrid sight as the Tyranids attempted to extract nutrients from planetary ecosystems rather than concentrated population centers. Consumption rate, 0.3% of normal efficiency. They're starving themselves trying to feed. The engagement had achieved objectives beyond our original projections. Not only had we prevented the consumption of 47,000 Eldar lives, but we had trapped an entire Tyranid splinter fleet in a strategic situation where their own success became the instrument of their defeat. Fleet-level coordination through hybrid prophetic methods, successful, I announced through the command network. Casualty rates, 94% below traditional engagement projections. Strategic objectives exceeded. But as we celebrated the tactical victory, reports began arriving from other engagement zones across Eldar space. The hybrid methods that had proven successful at Myrmidon were being tested in dozens of similar situations as our scattered race adapted to post-manipulation reality. Craftworld Ulthwé reports successful coordination with Inari death specialists in repelling chaos incursion, came word from the Wraithbone cities. Simhan Wild Riders achieved 340% improvement in survival rates using intuitive death awareness in close combat situations. The successes were encouraging, but they came with costs that traditional Eldar culture struggled to accept. Each victory using hybrid methods moved our race further from the elegant future guidance philosophy that had sustained us since the fall and closer to the death communion practices that fundamentally altered Eldar consciousness. "We're winning," Farseer Alaithriel observed as she monitored reports from across our scattered civilization. "But we're also becoming something different from what we were. The question is whether what we're becoming is worth preserving." Through my transformed perception, I could see the truth she referenced. Our adaptation to post-manipulation reality was creating a new form of Eldar consciousness, one that embraced uncertainty and death awareness rather than seeking transcendence through prophetic control. It was evolution born of necessity, but evolution nonetheless. The battle for Myrmidon Prime was over, but the larger war for Eldar identity in the post-manipulation galaxy had only begun. We had proven that hybrid prophetic methods could provide tactical advantages comparable to traditional sight, but we had also demonstrated that those methods required fundamental changes in what it meant to be Eldar. As the crippled Tyranid fleet drifted through space around the now useless worlds they had successfully captured, I contemplated the cosmic irony of our situation. We had broken free from cosmic manipulation, only to discover that freedom required accepting death as the foundation of tactical awareness. Perhaps that acceptance was itself a form of transcendence, not the elegant rise above mortality that traditional Eldar philosophy promised, but a deeper integration with reality that acknowledged death as the price of genuine choice. The hybrid prophetic methods had passed their first major test, but the examination of their long-term consequences had only just begun. Chapter 7. Consequences and Evolution. 6 months after the Myrmidon engagement, the full scope of our prophetic evolution began to manifest across Eldar civilization, with consequences that reached far beyond military applications. The hybrid methods that had proven successful in combat were creating ripple effects throughout every aspect of our post-fall culture, transforming not just how we saw the future, but how we understood our place in the cosmic order. I stood in the renovated dome of crystal seers on Ulthwé, watching as teams of traditional Farseers worked alongside Inari death specialists to train the next generation of hybrid prophets. The Wraithbone walls bore inscriptions in both classical spiral patterns and angular Ennead script, creating a visual representation of the philosophical synthesis our race was undergoing. Adaptation proceeds, but not without casualties, reported Farseer Alaithriel, her death sight now enhanced by months of training in certainty perception techniques. We've lost 47 seers to death obsession psychosis, but gained 312 functional hybrid practitioners. The mathematics favor continued implementation. The numbers represented more than statistical abstractions. They mark the transformation of Eldar consciousness from its traditional forms into something unprecedented in our 10,000-year post-fall history. Each successful hybrid practitioner represented an individual who had learned to embrace uncertainty and death awareness while maintaining functional connection to their cultural identity. "Show me the latest projections," I commanded, gesturing toward the central scrying pool that now operated through synthesis of traditional website and Inari death communion. "How is the adaptation affecting our long-term survival probabilities?" The vision that emerged from the pool was unlike anything possible through traditional prophecy alone. Instead of showing branching timelines of potential futures, the hybrid site revealed probability matrices where certainties constrained possibilities in mathematically precise patterns. Death provided absolute reference points around which all other projections could be calculated with unprecedented accuracy. Immediate survival projections improved by 340% over pre-adaptation baselines. The pool showed through cascading data streams that combined future sight with inevitability analysis. Long-term cultural coherence projections decreased by 67% due to fundamental philosophical shifts required for hybrid consciousness. The trade-off crystallized our species' central dilemma. The new prophetic methods were keeping us alive and competitive in the post-manipulation galaxy, but they were also transforming us into something that bore increasingly little resemblance to traditional Eldar civilization. "The young ones adapt more easily," observed Master Seer Calith, who had been monitoring the training programs across 17 different craft worlds. Eldar born after the Weaver's influence ended show natural affinity for uncertainty navigation. They don't experience the psychological displacement that affects those of us trained in traditional methods. The generational divide was becoming a defining characteristic of post-adaptation Eldar society. Young Eldar, who had never known reliable future sight, embraced death awareness and uncertainty navigation as normal aspects of consciousness. But older generations, particularly those of us who remembered the elegant certainty of traditional prophecy, struggled with methods that felt fundamentally alien to everything we had believed about fate and destiny. "Cultural evolution or cultural dissolution?" Farseer Alaithriel asked, his ancient perspective uniquely qualified to evaluate changes that spanned centuries rather than decades. Are we witnessing the natural development of Eldar consciousness, or are we facilitating our own extinction through transformation into something no longer recognizably Eldar? The question haunted every discussion of our adaptation progress. The hybrid methods were undeniably effective. Casualty rates had dropped, coordination had improved, and our ability to compete with races whose predictive abilities remained intact had been restored. But the price was the gradual abandonment of philosophical principles that had defined Eldar identity since before the fall. Through the renovated chamber's crystal walls, I could observe training sessions that illustrated the scope of the transformation. Young Eldar learned to perceive death certainties as navigational aids rather than sources of existential terror. They developed intuitive understanding of probability storms that older generations could only analyze through intellectual effort. "The path system requires modification," reported Farseer Alaithriel, whose expertise in guiding Eldar psychological development had become essential to managing adaptation stress. Traditional paths assumed prophetic sight would provide clear guidance about the consequences of emotional extremes. Hybrid consciousness requires new approaches to psychological stability. The path system, the elaborate framework of specialized life roles that prevented Eldar from falling to the emotional excesses that had birthed Slaanesh, had been built around the assumption that seers could provide clear future sight to guide individual psychological development. Without reliable traditional prophecy, the entire system was becoming unstable. Preliminary path modifications show promise, Alaithriel continued, her report carrying hope tempered by uncertainty. Instead of prophecy-guided emotional control, we're developing uncertainty acceptance techniques that achieve stability through embracing rather than avoiding psychological complexity. But the most significant changes were occurring in areas our initial planning had never anticipated. The death awareness components of hybrid prophecy were creating new forms of spiritual perception that challenged fundamental assumptions about Eldar souls and their relationship to the warp. Something unprecedented is happening with our spirit stones, reported Chief Bonesinger Thalador, whose expertise in Wraithbone technology made him uniquely qualified to monitor spiritual infrastructure changes. Exposure to death communion is altering the resonance patterns of individual soul matrices. The stones are evolving. The implications were staggering. Spirit stones had been the foundation of Eldar spiritual technology for 10,000 years, protecting souls from Slaaneş's hunger and enabling resurrection through Wraithbone constructs. If the hybrid prophetic methods were altering spirit stone functionality, they were potentially changing the fundamental nature of Eldar existence. "Show me the resonance analysis," I commanded, extending my consciousness toward the technical displays Thalador had prepared. The patterns that emerged were both beautiful and terrifying. Spirit stones from hybrid practitioners showed harmonic structures that had never been observed in traditional Eldar souls. Increased psychic capacity, enhanced warp resistance, but also fundamental alterations in post-death viability, Thalador explained, his technical analysis cutting through my emotional reaction to focus on practical implications. The hybrid consciousness may be making us more resistant to chaos corruption, but it's also making traditional resurrection techniques unreliable. The discovery added another layer to our species' transformation. Not only were we developing new forms of consciousness, but those forms might be creating permanently altered souls that couldn't be maintained through traditional spiritual technology. We were potentially evolving beyond our own infrastructure. "Emergency consultation with the Inari spiritual specialists," I ordered, recognizing that we needed expert guidance on death communion effects that exceeded our traditional understanding. If our souls are changing, we need to understand whether the changes are beneficial or catastrophic. But even as we grappled with the spiritual implications of our transformation, reports began arriving that forced us to confront the broader cosmic consequences of breaking free from the Weaver's influence. The prophetic dark age we had created was affecting far more than just the Eldar race. "Intelligence reports from Imperial sources," announced Communications Officer Vyleth, her analysis of intercepted human communications revealing disturbing patterns. Astropathic accuracy has decreased by 73% across the segmentum solar. The Emperor's Tarot is producing contradictory readings that are paralyzing Imperial strategic planning. The scope of our cosmic intervention was becoming clear. By severing the artificial threads that had maintained prophetic stability, we had created galaxy-wide uncertainty that was affecting every race with any form of prescient ability. The Imperium's massive bureaucracy, built around astrological prediction and psychic communication, was beginning to suffer cascade failures. Tau Earthcast reports indicate similar disruptions in their probability analysis systems, Vyleth continued. Even the Tyranid hive fleets are showing signs of coordination difficulties. The collapse of artificial prophetic stability is affecting every major galactic power. The realization that our choice had cosmic, rather than merely local consequences, forced us to consider whether we bore responsibility for the chaos spreading throughout the galaxy. By choosing freedom from manipulation for our own race, had we doomed other species to navigate uncertainties they were unprepared to handle? "Incoming priority communication from Craftworld Ulthwé," announced the Wraithbone communication array. They report successful contact with pre-fall archival consciousness. Ancient knowledge about the nature of prophecy itself. The communication that followed changed our understanding of both our situation and our responsibilities. Deep within Alaithoc's infinity circuits, ancient Eldar consciousness from before the fall had been awakened by the disruptions in prophetic stability. These ancestral minds carried memories of prophecy as it had existed before cosmic manipulation, chaotic, uncertain, but authentically connected to the natural flow of causality. The artificial stability was never natural, the ancient consciousness transmitted through Alaithoc's communication systems. Prophecy in its original form was always chaotic and uncertain. What you call the collapse of stability is actually the restoration of prophecy to its natural state. The revelation reframed our entire understanding of what we had accomplished. We had not destroyed galactic prophecy. We had freed it from artificial constraints that had been imposed by cosmic manipulators for purposes beyond ordinary consciousness. The current chaos was not permanent dysfunction, but a transition period as natural prophetic abilities readapted to unmanipulated reality. Evolution, not destruction, I breathed, the truth settling into my consciousness with the weight of cosmic revelation. Every race with prophetic ability is being forced to develop natural rather than artificially enhanced sight. The chaos will stabilize as consciousness adapts. But the ancient consciousness also brought warnings about the challenges that lay ahead. The transition to natural prophecy would require fundamental changes in how galactic civilization functions. Successfully evolved would gain access to forms of sight more powerful than anything the artificial system had provided. The galaxy enters a new age, the ancient voice transmitted across space and time. An age where consciousness must learn to navigate uncertainty through wisdom rather than relying on artificial guidance. Your race has triggered the beginning of universal prophetic evolution. As I contemplated the scope of what we had set in motion, I realized that our personal adaptation was just the beginning of a galactic transformation that would unfold over millennia. The Eldar had become pioneers in prophetic evolution, developing techniques that other races would eventually need to master or face extinction in a universe where artificial guidance no longer functioned. We have a responsibility, I announced to the assembled Farseers and Aeldari representatives, not just to complete our own adaptation, but to guide other races through the transition we've forced them to undergo. We broke the old system. We must help build what replaces it. The hybrid prophetic methods that had begun as a survival necessity for the Eldar that might define the galaxy's future. We had chosen freedom over safety, uncertainty over control, and in doing so had begun a transformation that would ultimately affect every thinking being in the cosmos. The question now was whether we could master the changes quickly enough to help other species navigate the chaos we had created, or whether our choice for freedom would lead to galactic collapse, as consciousness throughout the galaxy failed to adapt to unmanipulated reality. The next phase of our evolution would determine not just Eldar survival, but the viability of consciousness itself in a universe suddenly free from cosmic control. Chapter 8: The Galactic Awakening. 1 year after breaking free from the Weaver's cosmic manipulation, the galaxy had become a crucible of prophetic evolution, where every species with prescient abilities faced the choice between adaptation or extinction. From my position in the newly constructed observatory of New Sight on Ulthwé, I monitored the transformation spreading across inhabited space like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The wraithbone chambers around me hummed with hybrid prophetic energy, as Eldar seers worked in coordination with consciousness from dozens of other species. What had begun as our desperate attempt to survive the collapse of artificial prophetic stability had evolved into the galaxy's first collaborative effort to develop natural prescient abilities that could function without cosmic manipulation. Status report from Sector Ultima Segmentum, announced Farseer Alaithriel, her consciousness simultaneously monitoring 17 different species adaptation programs. The Tau have achieved 67% functional integration of uncertainty navigation techniques with their existing technological prediction models. Human navigator houses report 23% success rate in developing natural warp sight that doesn't require artificial enhancement. The numbers represented more than statistical progress. They marked the emergence of a new form of galactic consciousness, where species that had previously competed for resources now collaborated to master the fundamental challenge of navigating unmanipulated time. The prophetic dark age we had accidentally created was forcing unprecedented cooperation between traditionally hostile civilizations. The Imperium's response has been particularly interesting, reported Master Seer Calith, whose specialized focus on human psychology made her uniquely qualified to monitor Terran adaptation efforts. Instead of trying to restore their old astrological systems, they're developing new forms of Emperor-guided prophecy that function through faith rather than psychic manipulation. Through the observatory's enhanced scrying systems, I could perceive the scope of human adaptation with unprecedented clarity. Across 1,000,000 worlds, human psychers were learning to navigate the warp through devotional techniques that used religious certainty as a replacement for the artificial stability they had lost. It was crude compared to our hybrid methods, but functionally effective for their particular form of consciousness. The Tyranid hive fleets present a different challenge, observed Autarch Melanian. His tactical expertise now focused on understanding how alien consciousness adapted to prophetic chaos. Their collective intelligence is fragmenting as individual bioships develop independent predictive capabilities. We may be witnessing the evolution of Tyranid individuality. The implications were staggering. The hive mind's collective consciousness had been one of the galaxy's most stable predictive systems, unaffected by the artificial manipulations that had constrained other species' development. But the restoration of natural prophetic chaos was forcing even the Tyranids to evolve beyond their original biological programming. First contact protocols with evolved Tyranid consciousness, I asked, though the question would have been inconceivable even months earlier. The idea of communicating with individual Tyranids rather than fighting the collective hive mind represented a fundamental shift in how galactic relationships might develop. Preliminary attempts successful, Melanian reported, his voice carrying wonder at developments that challenged every assumption about alien psychology. Individual bioships separated from hive mind control show capacity for learning and even rudimentary cooperation. They're developing new survival strategies that don't require consumption of other species, but the most significant transformation was occurring among the younger generations of all species. Consciousness that had developed during the transition period showed natural abilities that exceeded anything possible under the old, artificially enhanced systems. Children born in the last year displayed intuitive mastery of uncertainty navigation that required months of training for older individuals to achieve. We're witnessing speciation in real time, Farseer Alaithriel observed, his ancient perspective uniquely qualified to evaluate changes occurring across galactic timescales. Not just cultural evolution, but actual cognitive development that's creating new forms of consciousness across multiple species simultaneously. The observatory's central scrying pool erupted with visions that showed the scope of the transformation from cosmic perspective. Across the galaxy, traditional forms of consciousness were fragmenting and reorganizing into new configurations that embraced uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of existence, rather than treating it as a problem to be solved. The question becomes whether traditional consciousness can adapt quickly enough to avoid extinction, I said, watching probability streams that showed entire civilizations facing collapse as their prophetic infrastructure failed. Evolution favors the adaptable, but the transition period is creating casualties on scales comparable to the war in heaven. The cosmic irony was inescapable. Our choice to break free from manipulation had created freedom for consciousness throughout the galaxy, but freedom always included the possibility of choosing extinction. Species that couldn't adapt to natural prophetic chaos were facing civilizational collapse as their artificial guidance systems failed completely. Emergency communication from the Toe Empire announced the communications array, its wraithbone circuits resonating with alien harmonics. They're requesting direct technical assistance with probability calculation systems that can function without artificial enhancement. The Toe request represented a breakthrough in galactic cooperation that would have been impossible under the old system of cosmic manipulation. Species that had previously maintained strict technological independence were now openly sharing adaptation techniques as survival necessities. Grant full access to hybrid prophetic training protocols, I commanded, accepting the responsibility that came with being among the first species to successfully navigate the transition. But include warnings about the consciousness changes required for effective implementation. The warnings were necessary because successful adaptation to natural prophecy required fundamental alterations in how consciousness related to time and causality. Species that attempted to use hybrid techniques without accepting the philosophical changes inevitably failed, often with catastrophic results for individual sanity. The orcs present a unique case, reported xenological specialist Alaithriel, whose studies of alien psychology had become essential to understanding adaptation patterns across different cognitive structures. Their instinctive approach to uncertainty means they've adapted more successfully than any other major species. What we treat as complex training requirements, they handle through intuitive aggression. Through the observatory's alien consciousness monitoring systems, I could perceive the orc adaptation with mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Their complete lack of traditional prophetic sight had actually been an advantage. They had no artificial systems to abandon and no philosophical assumptions to overcome. They simply embraced chaos with enthusiastic violence and developed natural prediction through combat experience. Recommendation for orc cooperation protocols, I asked, though the question felt surreal given our species' traditional relationship with greenskin raiders. Surprisingly viable, Alaithriel replied, her analysis suggesting possibilities that challenged millennia of Eldar assumptions about orc nature. Individual orc warbands separated from WAG. Collective consciousness show capacity for tactical cooperation and even strategic planning. The prophetic chaos is forcing them to develop individual intelligence. But as we celebrated the unexpected successes in galactic adaptation, disturbing reports began arriving from the galaxy's edge territories. The regions where the Weaver's influence had been strongest were experiencing complete prophetic collapse rather than evolutionary adaptation. Void fleets report total navigation failure in Sector Ghoul stars, came word from our deepest range scouts. Space-time itself appears unstable in regions where cosmic manipulation was most intensive. Reality is losing coherence as the artificial support structures fail. The revelation forced us to confront the possibility that breaking free from manipulation might never recover. The Weaver's influence had been so deeply integrated into the structure of reality in some regions that removing it had damaged space-time itself. Evacuation or stabilization? I asked, though both options seemed beyond our current capabilities. Neither, came an unexpected response from the communication array. This is the Weaver itself requesting direct consultation. The presence that touched our consciousness was changed from the cosmic manipulator we had confronted a year earlier. Instead of vast, alien intelligence pursuing incomprehensible goals, we encountered something that felt almost diminished. Still immensely powerful, but constrained by the consequences of its own cosmic engineering. You have taught me something I did not anticipate. The Weaver's mental voice carried acknowledgement of error that seemed to cause it profound discomfort. Consciousness that develops naturally is more robust than consciousness that develops through guidance. Your choice to break free from manipulation has proven more successful than my careful cultivation. Through our enhanced perception, we could sense the Weaver's struggle to understand developments that exceeded its cosmic calculations. Its manipulation had been based on the assumption that guidance was superior to freedom, that controlled development was more reliable than natural evolution. Our success in adapting to prophetic chaos had challenged fundamental principles it had accepted for cosmic ages. The damaged regions can be stabilized, the Weaver continued, but only through cooperation between natural and artificial consciousness. I require assistance from species that have successfully adapted to unmanipulated reality. The request represented a reversal so complete, it felt like temporal displacement. The cosmic intelligence that had manipulated galactic development for millions of years was asking for help from the consciousness it had previously controlled. Terms? I asked, unwilling to trust an entity whose manipulation had nearly cost our species its freedom. No manipulation, the Weaver replied immediately. No hidden agendas, no cosmic control. I offer technical assistance with reality stabilization in exchange for knowledge about natural prophetic development. The universe requires both artificial precision and natural adaptability to survive the approaching convergence. The mention of the convergence, the cosmic choice point the Weaver had originally been preparing for, reminded us that breaking free from manipulation had not eliminated the ultimate challenge facing universal consciousness. The moment when reality would face evolution or extinction still approached in the deep future. Joint stabilization protocols, I agreed, accepting that cooperation with our former manipulator might be necessary to preserve the regions damaged by our liberation. But consciousness remains free to choose its own development. No return to artificial guidance systems. The agreement marked the beginning of an unprecedented phase in galactic history. Cooperation between natural and artificial intelligence to prepare for cosmic challenges that exceeded either approach alone. The Weaver's vast calculations combined with consciousness that had learned to navigate uncertainty through wisdom rather than control. Implementation begins immediately, the Weaver announced, its presence already beginning to withdraw toward the damaged edge regions. But understand, the convergence approaches sooner than my original calculations predicted. Natural consciousness development occurs more rapidly than artificial cultivation, which accelerates the universe's approach to its evolutionary choice point. As the cosmic intelligence faded from our perception, I contemplated the magnitude of what we had achieved and what still lay ahead. The galaxy was awakening to forms of consciousness that embraced uncertainty and change rather than seeking control and stability. But that awakening was also accelerating the approach of the cosmic moment when everything would face ultimate transformation. Status summary, I commanded, seeking to understand where the galactic awakening stood after a year of unprecedented change. 73 major species showing successful adaptation to natural prophetic methods, Velthara reported. 41 species facing extinction through inability to adapt. 17 species evolving beyond their original cognitive limitations. 6 species developing entirely new forms of consciousness that don't fit established categories. The diversity of outcomes reflected the fundamental nature of freedom. Consciousness faced with genuine choice developed in directions that no form of guidance could have predicted. The galaxy was becoming a laboratory of consciousness evolution, where every successful adaptation opened new possibilities for development. And our own species? I asked, though I could already perceive the answer through our hybrid sight systems. The Eldar are becoming something unprecedented, Thalasos replied, his ancient wisdom uniquely qualified to evaluate our transformation. We remain recognizably ourselves, but we have gained capabilities that exceed traditional limitations. We are evolving into cosmic citizens capable of cooperation across species boundaries while maintaining our cultural identity. Through the observatory's enhanced perception, I could see the truth of his assessment. The Eldar race had not lost its essential nature through adaptation. We had discovered deeper aspects of our potential that had been constrained by artificial prophetic systems. We were becoming more ourselves, rather than less. The galactic awakening continued across inhabited space. Consciousness throughout the galaxy learning to navigate uncertainty with wisdom, while preparing for the cosmic choice that would ultimately determine the nature of reality itself. We had chosen freedom over safety, and that choice was transforming not just our species, but the fundamental character of existence in the universe. The question now was whether consciousness throughout the galaxy could develop the wisdom necessary to choose evolution over extinction when the convergence finally arrived. Our prophetic revolution had given the universe the freedom to choose its own destiny, but freedom always included the possibility of choosing destruction. As the galaxy awakened to unprecedented forms of consciousness, we faced the ultimate test of whether natural development could produce wisdom sufficient to guide universal evolution toward transcendence rather than entropy.